everybody. Thanks so much for being here for our staff discussion of Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. This is a youth memoir, which obviously all of you know because you read it, but I'm just saying that for anyone who might be listening. And we're going to talk about it today. I'm really excited to hear everyone's thoughts on the book. My name is Elizabeth. I'm hosting this discussion, and I wanted to open with a somewhat obvious statement, but one I think that is really worth exploring in this book, and that is that it's written in verse. It's not uncommon to see books written in verse, but it's also not what I would consider common, especially memoirs. And I just wanted to just open the conversation with that. You know, why do you think Woodson made that choice? What do you think it added to the memoir or perhaps took away? And just kind of your thoughts on the verses and how she styled the book.
Well, I would say one of the things I really enjoyed about it being in verse, and I think this is kind of a benefit to something being written in verse, is that the form of your writing can reflect the content. Like the way that Woodson has these haikus, I think they're called How to Listen. It's like 1 through 10 all the way through the book. And then she talks about how writing haiku was her first form of writing poetry. And it also seems like poetry was her first way of writing something. It was the first thing after copying lyrics that she was sort of able to do. So I just like the way that the form and the content reflect one another.
I also really liked that. I thought it made it actually a little nice to break things down in a way and be able to go back. So especially with the haikus and the different numbered poems, I thought it was nice to be able to go back and fit all those things together and sort of enjoy the message in a different way. So I thought that was pretty neat.
I also like the fact that, or I'm not a writer, I'm not an author, but it seems like the author would have had to make more deliberate choices in the words to use to tell the story. And the words are so emotive, and there's so few words on each page, but you get a full picture of the emotions of the people in the room or the people that she's speaking of or the emotions she's feeling herself. So I thought for this, I think it's unique to have, like you said, Elizabeth, like a memoir written as a youth book that is poetry. I thought it was really, really beautiful. And I was happy to read her story in verse. I just felt every word meant so much more.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Amanda said. I agree with that. It really made me, the reader, feel like I could grasp the mood that Jacqueline Woodson was going for in any particular telling of an episode, and also what other folks were saying earlier. It just encouraged me to go back and read things in a different way because it was so approachable. It wasn't this, dense narrative. Instead, it encouraged me to kind of sit with stuff. Like if, for instance, when her grandfather passes away, it encouraged me to kind of sit with that emotion because there wasn't, a deluge of words on the page. There's just something that encouraged me to stop and linger. Yeah.
I also think because poetry is a little less linear than the way you would normally read a book, it also lends itself really well to like creating an image in your mind based on the format of the poem and how you're using the words. And so rather than being caught, or not caught, but rather than following a story from this moment to this moment to this moment, you're kind of seeing and feeling the story on each page as a unit, as well as part of the overall picture. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think poetry was a wonderful choice for this, for her style of writing. It's just beautiful.
To me, I think one of the interesting results of the verse was that it felt very much like the way that childhood memories are, where the emotion comes through so clearly. but also the details are kind of sparse. And then it almost feels to me like a book of like memories that have just kind of been collected in chronological order, which I think is really interesting because that's how my memories from childhood are like. So it was like very familiar in a way, or like maybe not familiar, but like you could connect with it very easily. So
I read part of it as a physical book, and then I also listened to pretty much most of it also an audiobook read by the author. And I was sort of surprised that when I was listening to it, it sounded almost like a regular book. It sounded like her writing style is very lyrical, but it also sounded like a regular book. Like, I don't know if I would have known it was poetry necessarily if I had just been listening to it, which I thought was really also interesting. And I changed how I sort of experienced the book when I was reading it also.
Yeah, I exclusively listened to it, and I did that because I like to listen to audiobooks, especially when they're by the author. And I also struggle with poetry, like tempo and rhythm and stuff. So I felt like it was really useful for me to read it from her perspective and her cadence. And I thought that added a lot of depth to my reading of it.
Mm-hmm. I also listened to it. I listened to the first 80% on audio, and then I finished it reading because reading is faster. But I was a little hesitant to listen to the audiobook because I knew that, like a book and verse, it can go fairly quickly, but you also have time to spend with the words on each page. And sometimes the layout of the word kind of lends itself to the weight of what the words could mean or where they fall in the sentences, or the lack of sentence structure. So I was a little hesitant to read it, but I was also drawn to it because I'm like, okay, it's read by the author. That's always a perk for me because I'm not a huge audiobook person. I've gotten better, but I just enjoyed this style of her reading her own work, and you really had time to sit with the moment. So in the end, I'm glad I listened to her reading it on audio. But I'm also glad I read a little bit of the book itself, so I could just see the words on the page.
Yeah, I have the book checked out. I looked at it a little bit, but definitely need to reread it on the page exclusively now that I have that experience.
I was really wondering what it would sound like if she was reading it while I was reading it. And I don't know why it didn't occur to me to just listen to it, like seek that out. But I'm glad to hear that you all did listen to it. And now I definitely will give that a shot. That sounds really interesting.
Well, thanks, everybody. I wanted to return briefly to something that Audrey brought up about the perspective of a child. And for most of this story, I had to keep reminding myself how young Woodson was in some of the memories that she's retelling. Some of the initial ones, probably aren't even really actual memories. When she's speaking about first moving down south, she was 1 year old. So it's probably not a real memory, but it's things that she's pieced together from her family retelling things, and maybe from feelings, or, potentially from partial, very early memories. But for me, so I did find myself kind of thinking like, oh, this isn't necessarily true exactly how things happened because she was so young. But then as I moved through the book, I realized it's totally true because it's her memoir, and these are her memories, and this is her lived experience. But I just thought Woodson did an amazing job of capturing the perspective of a child, but also conveying experiences that she probably didn't understand even at the time, but that maybe as an adult readers we are understanding. I just wanted to comment that. So anyway, maybe there's not further thoughts on that, but if anyone wants to say anything, I'm going to give a moment.
Yeah, I would agree. It definitely felt true, even if it's not necessarily true. I don't know. I mean, memories are kind of like that anyway. But even the very first one about her birth, still just felt true. It felt like a memory. I have memories, but really it's things that my mom or my dad or other people have told me, but it still is a true memory that I carry. So I'm glad she included it. I think it added texture to everything.
I think the other thing about it feeling kind of memory-ish is we as a society like often have this kind of idealized idea of what childhood is like. And the reality of it is that like kids encounter all sorts of things out in the world, and including like less pleasant experiences or like those brushes with like bigger ideas that are less pleasant. It felt like honest, or very honest in a way that is like true to childhood, at least to me. So.
No, I totally agree, because there are some ideas or thoughts that she mentions. And as an adult reader, I want more information about, well, why did that happen? What happened to her father? But to her, she just knows that X happened and now this is what they're doing. So I thought that was absolutely true to like how a child would remember or perceive a situation that they had lived through. It was just like, this is what's happening and this is how I remember it. And I thought that was absolutely true of like how a child would view like the smaller lens of the world around them.
Amanda, I have to agree. There were some parts that I felt almost frustrated because I wanted more information about what had happened. And I had to remind myself, like, that's not what this memoir is. These are not like, this is she's telling her story from her perspective. It's not about like, I want to know like the background information. Like, did she ever see her dad, or like what happened when the person fell down the stairs? Like, I wanted that kind of information. And I think it made the book better to me that we weren't given all these details. That's not the kind of memoir that it was. It's not about that. It's about her lived experience and what she perceived. Anyway, I also wanted to revisit briefly something Lucy brought up before we kind of move away from the concept of it being written in verse, and that's the 10 haikus, the how to listen. I just wondered if anyone had a thought about why those were called that. And, we know that her first type of writing, she would try haikus, but I just wondered just what you thought of those being interspersed and the locations of them and the topics of them throughout the book, if anyone had any thoughts about those.
I pulled them all out and wrote them down so I could read them as like one piece. And I think, I'm not sure exactly what they mean, but I think in combination with this being her collected memories from her childhood and how she learned to write, like she wasn't a good reader, she says. She even struggled with writing. She had to learn to write by copying lyrics of songs and listening to them over and over again. So I think this is just another reminder of how she received her memories, and then how she kept them is by different ways that she listened. And they also kind of reflect, like if you put them in order, they reflect what is happening in that piece of the story at that time. So it was an interesting exercise to just kind of pull them out and look at them on their own.
I will say that having listened to the audiobook, the haikus didn't fall on me for the longest time. And then as I was flipping through the book to see how far I was in the paper book, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, because you see it in print and it's very visual. You see how to listen number 4 and you see the haiku. So when I was listening to it on audio, you could hear what she was saying, how to listen number 4, but it wasn't, I kind of breezed through them. So I feel weird about that now. I feel bad. But that's audio versus print.
I wondered if it was also part of just how she organizes memory in her own brain, since she's dyslexic. I know that I think in an interview I read with her, she was talking about how she reads everything out loud and how she's still like a slow reader and a slow writer. And so I wondered if poetry was just like something deep fundamental about how her brain works, that it just like works for her. Especially knowing that how it's written is very much like poetry, but then how it sounded when I was listening to it was very more straightforward narrative. The inclusion of the haikus, I wondered if it was just more about like her process and her brain. I didn't pull them all out. I thought about it. So I wondered if how that experience would be, but.
Was her original, like, first collection of poems was the butterfly poems. I think those are also in haiku. So it seems like that is something that she's been really connected to since she first began writing.
Yeah, it's interesting now that like we're talking about it, I'm thinking more about hearing and remembering that she had trouble writing and that she reads everything out loud. But I wonder also if the thing about a haiku is that you always have this formula. So you have like a template and you can put a memory in there. I don't think it's any less challenging to write a haiku than other forms of poetry. It might even be more challenging, but I think that perhaps there's something about having that part set up for you. It's going to have to do 5 syllables, 7 and 5. And I mean, I don't know. I'm just guessing, but as we're talking about it, it kind of just came to mind.
That actually occurred to me too. I was thinking the same thing because to me, a haiku is, to me, probably one of the most accessible forms of poetry, just because, it's not always easy to read or definitely not to write poetry. But I think if you've got that structure in place as a reader of poetry, I find it easier to look at and sort of wrap my brain around this short little piece. So I think that might be maybe part of it.
Yeah, I just have a question about this since we're talking about this How to Listen series. I'm just curious as to why, I don't know why Woodson chose to title them How to Listen instead of How to Be a Writer or How to Remember. They're really about listening. And when I read them, I just thumbed through just and randomly caught 3. They're not like explaining how she is a good listener. Some of them are memories. Some of them are just like invitations to be still and listen. But there's no like, I don't know. It doesn't seem like that is a through line through all of them. It's just interesting. I wonder why listening is the operative word.
I think, when we were talking before about how Woodson doesn't exactly tell you everything that's going on when she talks about a particular event. And when you think about how to listen, I think both of those, to me, I was struck in the book by what she doesn't say. And, when we talk about some things that she didn't write, if you think about life from a child's perspective and even about really important events in your life, sometimes as a child, you aren't aware of everything that's going on. You're aware of what affects you. Mm-hmm. You're aware of something that makes you really happy or something that makes you really sad or scared. And you're aware of what other people how they might be reacting, but you might not be aware of all of the other things that are going on in the background. And I think that's probably true for all children. And she captured that really well, because I know even from my own perspective, when I think about certain events that happened when I was really young, part of those events I never knew about until I was older, partly because people were trying to shield me from stuff or thought I was too young to know that. And I think that you kind of, when she talks about how to listen, I think that it's kind of like you have to listen to what isn't being, explicitly said, as well as what you can see. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah, for me, I think too, it's sort of kind of a pause or a quiet. It's like a moment when you're reading the book, it's kind of a pause in between things. And it's a way to sort of observe or contemplate or visualize what's around you, just like listening, not listening like specifically, but just absorbing what's around you, just a sort of a pause or a stillness.
So in that way, do you think it's like for us readers?
I don't know. I mean, here's one, How to Listen number 2. In the stores downtown, we're always followed around just because we're brown. Then How to Listen number 7 is Enjoy the Silence. Has a story to tell you. Just listen. Listen. So they're different, but yeah, it's interesting.
She does finish it. There is one haiku at the end that's not numbered, that's just called How to Listen. And it says, if your story's true, our grandmother reminds us, you'll remember it. So I wonder if those haikus are just like different ways of trying to remember things, or how am I going to capture these memories? You know, maybe that last haiku that's called How to Listen but isn't numbered is meant to tie it together.
How to Listen, number 10. Write down what I think. I know. The knowing will come. Just keep listening.
Yes, to me, that haiku Amanda just read kind of like summed up what I was thinking of them, where it was more about trying to capture these like larger life, I don't want to say lessons, but like maybe like themes or like moments that are kind of bigger than us. Because even the haiku number 2 about people being followed in stores is like, that's something that's so much larger than an individual, right? So the haikus to me kind of captured these moments where you're which is a common human experience, I think, where you're reaching towards these bigger ideas, right? You're looking up at the sky and seeing all the stars in the sky, and you're just a tiny little human. And like those moments can be beautiful, but they can also be not. Mm-hmm. And I think I like that she had included like both sorts of big moments. But that was what that made me think of.
Part of what I really liked about the book is some of the images are so beautiful and are so evocative that you can like smell the smells and, you know, see what she's describing really well. And at the same time, there are parts of the book where she's describing something in a very simple, straightforward way, and yet the sense of loss is really an impact. You know what I mean? It's like you feel there's a lot more emotion going on than what she's putting down in the words. Mm-hmm.
Well, and because it is from a child's perspective, you don't get the adult perspective, which I think is fine. But, you know, thinking about if I understood what correctly, her mom like lost 2 of her siblings quite young, the brother being hit by a car and the sister falling. And like, you know, Woodson was sad, of course, but you don't really get the perspective of the sister who's lost 2 young siblings and you know, like that, you don't get her mother's grief at all, but you kind of know that that's there just because she's able to kind of, as you said, Dee, like evoke it, but just not, you know, you don't feel it from the adult perspective, but it's still there kind of in the ether, if you will. I don't know. I wanted to talk a little more about her family. And I wanted to sort of bring up one of the earliest instances in the book, which is her parents' separation, and which, at least to me, was very much tied to also the difference, the North and the South. You kind of get the impression that Woodson's father is, you know, his family's from Ohio. He really does not have any desire to return to go to the South, and her mom is. She goes with her parents. There's this tension. They end up separating, and Woodson spends much of her early childhood in the South before her mom wants to move to New York and eventually finds this place for them there. How did you think like the sense of family and the sense of place tied together in this book, and how it tied together or was separated for Woodson as she was growing up?
She's really little when the separation occurs. So I think that some of what she describes is somewhat based on what her siblings are feeling too, as well as whatever feelings her mom was having at the time. because she was, I think, a little bit too young to really be directly, well, no, that's not true. She wouldn't be too young to be directly impacted. But I think that the perception of everyone around her would have a strong influence on her because of her age.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind when you ask that question for me, Elizabeth, is the fact that Jacqueline Woodson and her siblings are shuttled from New York City to South Carolina and back again and back again. And this feeling that she describes somewhere like halfway or later in the book about not feeling tied to any particular place. Like the kids in the South make fun of her for talking super fast, like in New Yorker. And also like her best friend, Maria, has another friend who's I guess like maybe culturally more aligned with Maria, and then Jacqueline experiences this sense of like, oh no, like is my friendship jeopardized because I'm not tight with her community, or I'm worried about this. So I think that feeling of like feeling untethered comes through in this memoir.
I think at one point she says something when she was leaving from one of the summers, she was going from New York to go down south to visit her grandparents. She says something like, we were leaving home to go back home. So she felt that sense of like, I love both of these places. They both mean a lot to me because she liked living in New York with her family and having the new brother and her best friend Maria, but she also was super attached to her grandparents, especially her grandfather, who was the father figure in their family, and she was really close with him. But I just love that sentiment of leaving home to go back home.
I think it's interesting too that it seems like so much of the or not so much, but she gets feelings about the South from her family members. Like she, as you're saying, Amanda, likes both places and is really, comfortable and pulled towards the South. But she hears her dad saying like, I won't go South anymore. And she hears her mother saying, don't ever call me ma'am. Like, I don't want any language that evokes the South. And she looks at how her brother, I think the South is a different experience for her brother. She says, my brother's almost allergic to it, like the heat. But I just thought that was interesting how we know she likes it, but she's also hearing these sort of negative things about it from other family members. And that might be coloring her view.
Yeah,
But
I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I also don't think it's just hearing negative things. Like there's also the behaviors she's told she has to adhere to like by her mother, like, and she does, but like the undertone of course is like, you have to do these things to be safe, but also like she talks about like the eyes lowered just enough, but like enough, but like high enough to like, I think it was something like preserve your dignity. Like there is like this tension between like the things, like the ways that you have to behave because you're a colored person, but also like how to do that in a way that allows you to maintain some semblance of humanity. And so there are only a few poems about that, but it also colors the South, which is like clearly this naturally beautiful place. She spends a lot of time like evoking that part of it in like really beautiful language. But there are these poems about the South that you don't see about the North, at least not in the same way, that kind of evoke this like underlying tension of that place.
I think it's also interesting that the people from the South see New York as this place lined with diamonds, and that's not the experience that anyone actually has there. So it's kind of like this idealized version of the North where this discrimination isn't happening, but it is happening.
But I think too, when the mother and father separate, the mother takes her family to her childhood home where she grew up, to her grandparents, because that's the option that's openly available to them at that point. But then after being there for a while, the mother still knows she wants to do something else. And then so the mother leaves on her own to New York to follow the brother to find something else. And while she's there, she ends up impregnated with this other baby, which I want to know so much about. And then she comes back to the South and says, okay, we're moving to New York, and the kids move. So I think it's good that the children had that sense of home and were so close to their grandparents in that relationship. And it was also interesting that the mother she left to go find something else for them. She didn't want I can't say she didn't want them to be there, but inevitably she made the choice to move her family to New York and have a different life there, in Brooklyn. And then they found a new sense of religion, and it was just a totally different experience that they had in the South.
I thought that like choice to move to New York was really interesting because the way, like the very beginning of the book where the mom is like starting to separate with her father, she talks about really loving Charleston, and then but when she has been there for a while with her kids, she decides to go to New York to like pursue these other opportunities. And I think it does kind of underline that that idea that like places can be complicated, right? And our memories of places can be complicated by our current circumstances. Yeah.
And also we're getting the point of view from a very small child who's moved around a lot and has a lot of people in her life. So there's these gaps of things.
Well, and kids are often super resilient, right? So, I mean, when she finds out they're going to New York, she's really sad. She doesn't want to leave her grandparents that she loves. She loves the South. She gets there. She's like, okay, there's no diamonds. There's no trees. But, then she meets Maria and they have her uncle and aunt there for, and like, she's like, okay, great. And I just think kids are just so amazing. They're so resilient and flexible. And I think that was absolutely like shown throughout this book of how adaptable kids are. And especially kids who grow up with a certain amount of hardship, like they adjust and they make do, and they live their life in certain ways, Mm-hmm. I can't remember who brought it up, but one of the things I found surprising about this book, or at least unexpected, is the role that religion ended up playing. It ended up being a very big part of Jacqueline's childhood, mostly due to her grandma. And I wanted to know more about that. I felt like, since we don't get the perspective as she gets past the book, we don't know exactly how that fully left her life. I did read an interview saying that she is no longer Jehovah's Witness. She does not practice that religion, but I just wondered what you thought about that. And I guess basically just what you thought about that, and how you thought maybe that affected her childhood, good, bad, neither. Just wanted to hear some thoughts.
I did think it was interesting that the mother didn't practice, but when they moved to New York, she continued to facilitate them going to church, even though she didn't attend with them. She would sit outside and wait for them.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting to see how she describes how her grandmother, says that they have to attend the church. They have to, their days are set up according to what day of the week this is going to happen and this is going to happen. And yet she also puts in there about, her grandfather's perspective, which is, I don't need to do that. I'm living my life the right way. You guys go do what you need to do. Right. And I kind of feel like maybe that, but having both of those there kind of shows that she was tuned into that a little bit. Like she has to do all this stuff, and yet, but obviously as a kid, you're going to follow what I think in this case, grandma was the law. So you're going to follow the law.
I think she also has the experience of, there's exclusion that comes with practicing this religion that she talks about, like noticing things that she misses out on, or having to leave the classroom, not participating in the Pledge of Allegiance, or just like that she has this little bit about never participating in birthday parties and still wanting those cupcakes. And it's kind of this interesting pull between what she's being told to do by adults and how that feels as a child. I thought that was a really interesting piece coming from a child's point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed that especially when she is talking about the stories that she makes up, and she mentions that I forget exactly what they're called, the fellowship halls become churches in her stories. If that was just a kind of an effort to fit in, or just see how that would be like to have that experience. it stood out, especially because I think she mentioned there's one other witness in her class. I'm all the time kind of gets mixed up, but when she's kind of like almost flirting with the idea of churches or making stories about that, it definitely seems kind of like more trying to fit in, which I think is very normal for kids to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think the poem where she talked about like leaving the classroom and stuff was also interesting, because she talked about the one Jehovah's Witness, or the other child that seemed to really like feel the faith, and her and the other girl that were going through the motions, sort of, or that's what it felt like. And I just thought it was interesting kind of commentary on religion, how it can kind of like connect really deeply with some people, but not others, even if you're raised in that faith.
Yeah, I just want to say, since you brought that part up, Audrey, I loved that particular poem. It just felt so true how, kids relate to religion, and how, some of them are going through the motions, and, I can relate to that, being dragged to church and going to Sunday school and kind of, not loving it, but just, it's the thing we do, and I thought that was very funny that the believer kind of felt like she was almost like catching Jacqueline and the other sort of less gung-ho Jehovah's Witness, like, hey, I've got my eye on you both. That also felt like a very, I don't know, childish, but somehow sweet, and very true way to relate to faith. I don't know. It just made me laugh. It made me laugh out loud.
I also think too that to flash forward when her uncle is released from prison and he is following Muhammad, and she's very curious about that. And there's a part where she says that on the rug, she kneels behind him, wanting to see his Mecca, wanting to know the place he calls the promised land. So she loves her uncle dearly, and she was very curious about, well, he does this thing. What is he seeing? What does he believe? I thought that was very, very intelligent and smart in her way of like sort of deciphering that information or seeking more from him. So it's another piece of religion coming into her life at a very young age.
I think there are a few times where she kind of notes the difference in religion experienced by her grandfather. And one time he's obviously he's a believer, but he doesn't go to church. He's not part of the same faith at all. And he's like, I am a good person. I've done good things. I know I'm fine. And then she has another experience where she's going out to collect money for people to be saved. They have to donate to be saved. And she's like just struggling to comprehend how that's possible. And she just really wants this nice lady to be saved because she's so nice, but she doesn't have a dime to give to them. So how can she be saved? And I just think those questions like are so relatable. A kid growing up and navigating different types of religious perspectives.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry. I just have to jump right in again and say that was darling. Yeah, that poem was, and that feeling was just like, oh God, that like caught my heart when, this sweet girl is thinking, gosh, this person's going to go to hell unless like we give her this, Jehovah's Witness tract. It's better than, we don't need her money, right? You could almost feel like the fear that she had. And another thing that kind of, she's a close observer of kind of the hierarchies of organizations and of the Jehovah's Witnesses. She wonders at one point why like women aren't allowed to give the sermons. Oh, well, okay, that's the thing. Like I've noticed that only men get to do that. I guess that's what we do. But she notices that, and one can extrapolate from these memories that she holds on to that, okay, maybe this is the reason why she's at this point, like not a practitioner. She ends, I think, this book with a poem about these various identities, right? And like believer and non-believer are two of them that these spaces that she inhabits. And I found that that's very important. This is a place that she got inspiration from. Her family members got various inspiration from, or certain of them. So it's important. But then also, like as others have said, there are these other incredible family members, Daddy, her grandfather, who don't and she knows, she kind of feels her way through that as a child. That was very profound.
Yeah, I think that religion for her is just a set of different worlds, kind of like the North and the South is. They're different worlds that she's looking at. And I was just sort of going over that poem that you mentioned, Lauren. Each World is the title of it. And she mentions all these different sort of identifiers that she's seen in her life that she might be able to fit into. And religion is one of them among many. But ultimately, you know, the worlds come together to make this thing called you. And I thought that was a super interesting and powerful way for her to end the book.
I wanted to also, thinking about this, you know, there's different people in her life that are experiencing religion in different ways. Some more quote unquote extremely, perhaps like her grandmother, some, you know, not really at all, in, you know, from what Jacqueline can tell, others, you know, partially. And I think in some ways that's also how people are experiencing the civil rights movement in this book. You see different members of her family having involvement in very different levels, which I thought was interesting. Of course, again, this is from a child's perspective. So Jacqueline does not exactly, I don't think, know how involved different people are. There's a few different poems about people going off, you know, and it's a little unclear, I think, if Jacqueline exactly knows what they're doing, but we kind of get the impression, or we feel like we do, at least I did. And I just wondered what you, as readers, thought about that and how you thought the backdrop of the civil rights movement, which kind of weaves itself throughout the whole book, affected the story and, you know, added to it in and how it affected, you know, the people around Jacqueline and her childhood.
I was really grateful for the different perspectives. I think it says a lot about what kids see. I know that obviously she wrote this as an adult and not as a kid, but like she's talking about people going off to the lunch counters and they're talking about being trained, and she recognizes that someone else didn't want to do that, but they were cooking for everyone. And so much of that has kind of been lost in like the mainstream history of like how we talk about the civil rights movement. So like we do talk about like Rosa Parks and people who marched and more visible things and less of the support roles of people cooking and feeding people. Mm-hmm. And so I just was really glad that this was included. It just shows like that kids saw it, even if it's kind of disappeared from like the larger conversation, but like it's still visible and was still super important to her to see all of that.
And I think too, when she's a little bit older and her and Maria see Angela Davis on TV, Power to the People, and they're inspired by her and they want to do what she's doing, and she wants to stand on the light pole and yell, and her mom's like, get down from there, you're going to fall. So even though it's important, and even though she doesn't quite understand all of the pieces, she knows that this affects her and her family, and she wants to be involved, even though she doesn't quite have all the pieces put together. I think I like that little bit of her and Maria, you know, doing those things. And too, I think she's inspired too by her uncle.
Yeah, I was going to mention the uncle. Like you said earlier, he was a big source for her exploration of religion and like the differences in religion that can present themselves. And she was also very inspired by his style, and his whole interest and everything that he did was such an inspiration to her, like throughout the whole book, throughout many different phases of his life. But that was a huge thing that he was invested in and one of his bigger priorities. So I think that was something that influenced her.
One of the like interesting details from the earlier poem Marissa mentioned about the woman who cooked was that like she specifically couldn't march, not necessarily because she didn't want to, but because her employer told her that no one who worked for her could be down marching or whatever. I can't remember how exactly the phrasing was, but I just thought that was a really interesting and important detail because I think particularly sometimes it's easy to assume that if people aren't marching, they don't care or, you know, don't get it or whatever. And I thought it was a powerful example of another way to support the movement, even if you couldn't be there for whatever reason.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Thank you, Marissa, for bringing up that passage, because I wanted to, but I wasn't sure if I read that in this book or I read that somewhere else. Yes, that was such an important passage, and just to tie it to what Audrey was saying, I think there's another moment when maybe it's her mom is going to work, or somebody's getting a vacuum on. Someone's going to work, and they mentioned that they don't like cleaning houses, but they must do it, right? Nobody likes going to go clean someone else's house so that the floor is, you can eat food off of it. When you're done cleaning, you're cleaning so hard and so well. You're cleaning someone else's house, right? No one wants to do that, but it made me think as a reader about the various ages of people and how the young are so important because they can kind of put themselves out there at the vanguard. They have nothing to lose, but the older folks too are important because they're supporting those people who are at the vanguard in various hidden ways. And that, I found that to be really interesting to think about. And I mean, I think that's the number one thing I'll take away from this book. I'll walk away knowing there's so many hidden forces and behind movements and behind those sound bites, right? And so many people, so many different roles to play in a revolution of consciousness.
Yeah, she's growing up in a time that was really pretty volatile in a lot of ways with the civil rights movement. But I liked the poem about the fabric store that she writes about earlier in the book, where she's like, so, there's restaurants in town and there's department stores and there's a dress shop and there's this, but we don't go there. We don't go to those places where they'll follow us everywhere to make sure we're not stealing. And we go to the fabric store where her grandmother knows the owner and they talk. And the way she puts it, we're just regular people.
And she has sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think that was really powerful to sort of show how she was still noticing how they were still excluded. And then she has a poem right after that called Ghosts about the painting over of the places where it said whites only, but on the bathroom doors, they didn't do a good job. So you could still see it. So she's like, so we're still being kept out. And I just thought that was such an interesting combination of a way a child would see something and still see those words, but the takeaway was very adult, we're still being segregated. And it's the same sort of thing in the fabric store. We don't go, even though we're allowed to go there, we're still being kept out because we're followed around.
And I think those thoughts and feelings are peppered throughout the entire book, each of the poems, because that's what was going on in the world around her. And even as a child, you can't ignore, something's going on. If you don't understand all the pieces, that this is right and that is wrong. And why are they doing that? And why would the FBI why would somebody want to send Angela Davis to jail? She's a hero. She's amazing. And she's still, I like that perspective. And I like still getting the information from her point of view, even if she doesn't have the whole story.
Well, it also showed up in really subtle ways. She talked about how in New York, the games poem where she talked about all the games they played and then how her mom would make her and her siblings come in earlier than all the other kids. And I think that a lot of that had to do with just what was going on in the world, right? And her mom wanting to make sure her kids were safe and not out even close to after dark, right?
Right.
But then it was Christmas in November, all those board games. Even though they didn't celebrate Christmas.
Oh, I didn't catch that when I read it. So is that it? Are you saying that the mom brought Jacqueline's mom brought all those board games because she wanted her kids inside? Okay, got it. Yeah.
Well, we're almost out of time. I had many more questions that I wanted to ask, but this was awesome. I do want to close. I was with just, I thought it was really interesting when I was kind of researching how to guide the discussion. One of the questions that came up in a lot of the like suggested book discussion questions was like, how is this book relevant to young people today? Which I was like, what? This is awesome. That's a dumb question. So I'm not asking that, but I am interested in how this is a youth book. We have it in our kids section at the library. I think to me, a lot of it was fairly subtle in what you picked up on. And so I'm wondering if there's any way that you can think about reading it as a child or reading it as a young person. And if you can think about any way that maybe you would teach the book. I know we're not teachers, but if you were to be reading the book to a child, or if you were a child reading the book, kind of what would stand out to you and what you would most want a child to pick up on in the book, because I think, maybe some of the subtleties might be lost depending on the child's age, but I think there's so much here, and I think it's so beautiful that I want to recommend it to children in my life. And I'm just curious, I don't know your thoughts about that, or what. I don't know. Hopefully my question made sense. I'll just stop talking and let you guys talk.
The one thing that I think that I would emphasize would be that she just really had this dream to be a writer from a really young age, but there were obstacles, especially because she struggled with reading, and people associate reading with writing. And so if you can't read, how are you ever going to go on to be a writer? And she accomplished that. And she, even through the perspective of a child, because she talks about that dream, but you're reading her book, so she's achieved this. And so that's something that I think I would really emphasize if I was giving this to a child, especially one that had a dream like that. And I think that I would have really liked this book as a kid, because I was a big rereader as a kid. And I think that this would be something that I would have liked to reread over and over again and get a lot out of each time. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, I agree. I think I would have really liked this as a kid. It seems like something I would have read multiple times and really enjoyed. As for what I would teach about it, I have no ideas.
I also think it would be good to put in the hands of kids who aren't sure about reading a bigger book or a chapter book. I mean, because though it's written in verse, that might seem intimidating, but it's actually very accessible. And I think you can show kids the page and be like, each of these words is very important, but it's also a visual experience. Like, how is this put on the page? There are just 3 lines on this page. There's all this space. So there's a lot to sort of take in besides just what she's written, and to think about why someone might write a book that way.
It might also be interesting to explore it in both audio and print form.
With Washington,
Yeah, I don't know if
our adult learners. Oh, sorry.
Please go ahead.
The adult learners that watch now literacy for basic literacy are often have dyslexia or another type of disability like dyslexia. And when we're trying to help them with reading and writing, I used this book a lot with adult learners and young adult learners. And it's interesting because some of the learners that I worked with who are African Americans related to the history in this book as if it were part of their own lives, because many of the learners that I taught had come from a family where their parents came north from a place in the South. And so there's a lot of memory of grandparents having been in the South when they were still alive, while parents were in the North. And so some of the things that she describes in the book was very relatable to them. And especially the family, and especially the not so subtle forms of discrimination that she dealt with. Teaching it to a child, I think, would still be not necessarily the same, but I believe that any child would be able to relate to this book, because there is still so much discrimination. It might be a little more subtle than the painting on the bathroom wall, but it's still there. And I think kids see it and recognize it and know what it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think there are so many elements teaching points you could do with the book. Lucy mentioned like having a dream, and like she struggled with reading and writing. Now she's a prolific writer. There's also the historical aspect of it. There's just the relatable things that how kids see the world. Like there are kids, you put this hand in the hands of a kid, chances are their parents are separated, or they've got siblings from different parents, or they've moved. Those are all relatable things, but it's in this backdrop of the 60s and 70s, this historical setting where there are civil rights things and discrimination going on in the world. So there's a lot of pieces. And then you throw in the element of like, hey, it's poetry, or it's a book written in verse, or hey, it's a true story, or hey, this is a memoir. There's a lot of pieces. And so I would be curious to see what do you pull from all of that to teach it like in a series of lessons.
It's also impressive. Even the young adults and adults with dyslexia, who, if you put a book in front of them and say, this was written by a person who had dyslexia, they're just like, what? How is that possible?
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth, your question makes me think about the way that adults and children fill in the spaces, the unwritten, differently, right? Because the question sort of is looking at it from like an adult perspective and the nuances and subtleties that we see as adult readers. But children, I feel like, having access to something else that we lose along the way, right? Like when children are experiencing, you can give a kid a cup, right? And that kid is going to have a whole experience with that cup that you would not have because you've lost that, right? So like in thinking about exposing or, sharing this book with a child, especially with some of the like almost dreamlike elements to it, I think it's important to remember that like children just fill in those spaces differently, right? And they may not need much in order to engage with the book because they're like coming to it with things that adults tend to have lost over time.
I completely agree. And thank you so much, everyone. I wish we had more time, but I want to be respectful of everyone who has many things to do. Thank you all. I appreciate it. I wanted to just let you know that our our public discussion of the same book is on November 17th at 6:00, and all are welcome to join for that as well. It's always great to have some staff support at those and to share your perspectives again with a new audience. So if you'd like to join November 17th at 6 p.m. And thank you again all for being here today. And I really appreciate it. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you.